My name is Matt Miller, and this is an interview which we're starting now with poet and translator Johannes Goransson. The interview is going to be published in the next issue of New American Notes Online, edited by Sean Scanlon. And I want to start this interview just by thanking you, Johannes, for agreeing to do the interview.
Thanks for organizing it.
As organized as it will be. And I thought I'd start with a question that I asked the very first interview that I asked many years ago with a very different, now deceased poet who I also admire, Hayden Carruth. And I asked him, what kind of state? This was in the late '80s, and I asked him, what do you think the state of poetry is right now, and where do you see it headed? So here we are in 2023. Very different poet. What do you think, Johannes?
Well, it's a huge question. One reason it is huge is because any answer, I think we would have to assume a certain homogeneity, or like there is a thing called poetry. I think something that interests me about poetry is exactly that it isn't, like the question isn't answerable simply. Like there are so many different, even within the US, there are a lot of different movements and groups doing different kinds of poetry. But also obviously I'm really interested in, and oftentimes feel more connected to stuff that's going on in other countries. So that even more complicates the answer. I think if you were to make like broad sweeping descriptions of what's going on, then I think you would have to focus on something like media or social media and media. You would have to focus on responses to, different responses coming from different directions to events that are taking place. Those would be like the simpler way to answer the question. But for me, the more interesting question, like the more interesting answer would have to be super detailed or myopic answers that have to do with what just one person is doing, or what two people are doing, or what a group of people are doing. But once you focus in like that, the answer becomes more interesting, but it becomes less legitimate. It's not a macro answer. So I guess I'm punting on the very first question.
Yeah, I mean, it is a hopelessly broad question, and I agree that the lack of coherence makes it difficult. And you're, being a poet of mixed ancestry with one foot in European poetics, one foot in American. I guess I was thinking about, I don't know, for lack of a better framework, Western poetics. Although I know you've also worked with outside of that tradition as well. But that sense that there's a lack of coherence, that there hasn't been anything you might call like a movement, like language poetry was or is in a long time. Is that lack of coherence in your mind an asset? It sounds like it kind of is in a way.
Yeah, isn't it more interesting than if a lot of people are doing different stuff? There is always the urge, I feel like, when we are discussing poetry, and especially like in academia, to create the cohesive, like this is what is happening right now. But whenever people do that, I always think of a million different exceptions, or often the very like exact opposite. If I were to like, if I were to mention some things that I thought were interesting, then I would say something like there's a lot of interesting stuff going on with media, not necessarily like social media or Twitter, but people whose writing take on different shape as it crosses different media. That's really interesting, and that's become more available to people now with technology and so on. I guess I'm sympathetic to an imagination that is constantly moving, crossing boundaries, rephrasing itself. So that I would say that would be something that I'm interested in, that I'm been paying attention to.
Is that ability to bypass the publishers and speak directly to audiences through different forms of media, is that mostly a positive development, or are there drawbacks to it as well? I guess I see drawbacks to it.
Oh yeah, so what drawbacks do you see?
Well, it does seem like the poetry I love the best often emerged out of a certain agreed upon set of conditions that were developed by not just one individual, but were like, I don't like, they weren't traditions in like a canonical sense, but they were like micro traditions or something. They weren't, not, wasn't one individual that led to Whitman. You know, it wasn't just Emerson. It wasn't one individual that led to Ginsberg. You know, Ginsberg's work is something I really like, and it would never have existed without the social context that it emerged from. So that lack of cohesion, maybe it does have, at least historically, has had some drawbacks, although I agree with you that there's always exceptions. And I agree that academics want to pinpoint things and define things, and poets hate being defined and pinpointed. So there's that push and pull and tug. I'm a little of both, and I like the definitions. I like being able to get a handle on things, but I don't want to like solidify things too much. But yeah, I mean, like, it does feel like if we had something more coherent, that there would be an easier way to judge things and to, I don't know, like, I'm not just a judge, but I guess I do want to know where I'm at, right? Ultimately, I want to know, and I want poetry to help me figure that out. And it's not.
Yeah. Well, Whitman did self-publish, and so there's that long tradition of even if he existed as part of a cultural movement, that he still had to publish it himself. And that's true of Rimbaud had to self-publish, basically, Emily Dickinson. But yeah, I agree. I mean, I think I mean, I'm not opposed to people making those arguments, or I'm slightly opposed to it. I guess I like it when people are kind of doing it to start a discussion. So you can say, well, a lot of people are doing this thing, and somebody else can counteract that, and maybe it can be like an interesting discussion. I mean, even dumb like best books of the year lists could be interesting if you were allowed to disagree with them, but you're not, so they're not interesting.
No, I don't think so either. I don't want to be in the best American whatever. I don't buy them or read those things. All the poetry that I read in them is boring, and I'd rather just scroll through my own Facebook feed and read the poems that pop up there, just like so many other people. So yeah, sure. I mean, I get it, but somehow I still do feel like there is that lack of cohesion may just be also reflecting a lack of concern, a lack of love for the art, just a critical mass necessary to make it feel more alive culturally than it is right now, at least as far as I see it. When poetry is most alive, doesn't it kind of form micro traditions on its own, just out of the social vitality of people getting together who love the same thing and so on? I don't see these as oppressive things necessarily. These can be really generative, helpful things.
No, I mean, I hear what you're saying. I think I mean, I see a lot of different, conflations and I don't know, like mixings and formations. And often they are in part of, I feel like sometimes I join a formation for a year or two and then move on. And that might be because I'm reading a certain journal, or it might be because I know somebody or whatever. Maybe part of the issue is actually having something to do with those best American, and the emphasis on awards, which tend to make invisible all the actual like cultural movements that are part of and isolate the worthiness into like one particular, the quality poet. And so maybe what's missing is actually more critical writings. It might be that people feel a little bit the people are unwilling to write about contemporary poetry that way, or that people are not publishing it, or maybe they are and I'm not reading it. But yeah.
No, I agree. I don't think they are. I think that and I mean, I wish critics would do a better job of it, but ultimately I think the attention's a good sign. I mean, if you're afraid to write a dissertation on whatever, on a contemporary poet or a group or whatever, because you know it's not going to be regarded as significant by the committee, and it's going to lower your chances of a job prospect, and you're being pushed into some other area because it's perceived as more politically savvy, that's not a good sign. I mean, that's not what living, thriving art forms tend to be doing.
That does happen a lot. I mean, I think that happens a lot. So that's unfortunate.
Yeah. Yet here we are, and we both keep doing it. You've been very successful at it in your most recent book, I believe, is Summer, right?
Well,
Which is,
I have another one, a collaboration with 2256x1504, which is the new quarantine,
oh,
which is
great. I haven't seen that yet.
yeah, I yeah.
Collaborations are an interesting case. Reminds me of when I first met you, one of the first poets that we both met together was Lynn Hygenian, and she was at Iowa. And she was getting together groups for collaborations at the time, was pushing that as a concept. And she was very enthusiastic about the idea of poetry and community building. I think a lot of us we showed up and went and did these collaborative group exercises. Some of us, I did anyway. And I was kind of enthused by the idea, but it never, I don't know. In retrospect, I'm not sure what I think. What do you think? Is poetry like a natural community building thing, or is that just seems so counterintuitive when you look at the history of poetry and all the lonely wackos that have dedicated their lives to it and mostly died lonely.
Well, I think the idea of community, which comes or came into popularity, I think maybe in the 90s, maybe partly as a result of language poetry entering the academy, it's really powerful and really pedagogically useful. Like when I teach grad students, once you start because I think actually most people have this model, whether consciously or not, that the writer is an individual and they depend on the approval of some higher, a critic or an award or publisher to say like, oh, now you are a real poet. And it's actually a very disempowered position. Like you are very passive and you're waiting for it to happen. Once you introduce this kind of like, whatever we want to call it, community-based or collaborative model, like you can start your own journal. You can work, having conversations with people online might be just as useful or just as interesting or productive as like getting published in some famous journal. That totally changes a lot of people, a lot of students that I've had, and it changes their approach to publishing and it changes their approach to writing. So I think that is really powerful. Community itself comes with a lot of issues that I have trouble with. So for me, it's like a way of unsettling this other model, like the meritocracy model, where, like, which is very hierarchical and insular and even provincial, and that disempowers people and feel like they're just like waiting to be approved of. But yeah, community has so much problem. Like in order to have a community, you have to exclude people. You have to, communities develop hierarchies really easily. Even the ones who want to be anarchistic, I feel like sometimes are the ones that are the most hierarchical.
Yeah, how do you keep from becoming the new gatekeepers?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, so that's community definitely has gates around it, right? I think what I've wanted, how I've tried to see poetry has been as like maybe taking something from community, but wanting a community that was open to self-estrangement and to open to in my book about translation, transgressive circulation, that phrase, transgressive circulation, is just like that the circulation will unsettle the community, be part of it. But then it's no longer really a community. Then it's something else.
The idea of like viral infection, it often appears in your work in the context of community and influence as a, so I don't know, do you consider that a metaphor, or what do you mean? How literally do you mean that? And if it's a metaphor, would you mind giving me a little bit of direction about what you're thinking of when you use that phrase to signify influence or whatever it is you're using it for?
Well,
Contagion?
yeah, I mean, I also talk about influence in a very, use a very traditional word like that. Maybe an infection or something like that maybe focuses on a almost kind of material influence, and maybe one that you're not entirely, you open yourself up to, but that you're not entirely in charge of. And also less of a linear influence. I mean, usually when we talk about influence, we talk about, we kind of fall back on like a Bloomian kind of account with tradition, and it's like you have to overcome Shelley or something like that. Whereas I feel like some of these metaphors that I use, like circulation and infection, are less linear and less patrilinear, maybe a little more anarchic, and also there's something inherently about traversing boundaries about them, traversing the boundaries of the body, but also the nation. These kind of like, but traversing them, not avoiding them, or not like rising above them. So,
well, I like them better than the metaphors that I feel like I inherited from my teachers, which were more like it was a seance or something. That just seems like bullshit. But contagion I like because it seems less in control. And I agree that we don't really have control over how we influence anybody. But there's something interesting about your approach to describing poetry, is why I started with this question. I think it could appear on the outside as strikingly negative, like
yeah.
I can't remember the exact quote, but it was one of your, maybe your third or fourth book, and it was something along the lines of let's see if I can remember. It was you said that poetry isn't good for us, and
Yeah.
there are those that want to keep up that facade, something along those lines. And if poetry isn't good for us, why do we want that? How does that make poetry seem attractive or relevant? Is it, I've never really understood that as a branding approach. It's not quite the right word, but
No, it's a terrible brand.
I want to feel terrible.
A much better one is like, this poetry is really good for you,
well, I mean,
work.
poetry is kind of good for me, I think. At least I'm happier when I'm writing it than I am when I'm not.
But that's not the same thing, though. I mean, that's not the same thing as it being good for you. I mean, like, there's a whole rhetoric going back, I don't know how long, about how like literature will make you a better person, but clearly it's not the case. Also, it's like a simplistic idea of morality, or like, but also poetry doesn't. I see no evidence that doesn't necessarily make you a good person, even if I believed in that model of the good person.
No, I agree.
But poetry does, like you said, poetry does a lot of things, and like it makes you happy, it makes you feel excited about something, especially when you're writing it, which I think is a notable aspect of it. Like you are in it, you are in the zone of poetry, and it's doing something for you. It's allowing, I mean, then it allows you to investigate, it allows you to not just investigate poetry, but like the world and yourself and your brain and what you're thinking about, and stuff might come out, and that stuff might not be nice or tolerable even. It might be painful. So, I mean, it does a lot of stuff. I think art's powerful, but it making you good, I think, is maybe a hallmark of poor reading and poor poetry. If that's what you're looking for, I think you have to read poorly. And the poetry that will satisfy you will be some pretty shallow poetry.
Yeah. And the community that you build may not be the kind of community I want to be a part of, at least. I like that. So poetry is contagion. It also reminds, does that thought originate with Burroughs? You think you're working out of a Burroughs thing with that? Language is a virus?
Um, it might be, yeah. I mean, I definitely read my share of Burroughs. Or just like also even, this is long before COVID. I mean, it's just like the metaphors of contagion are so powerful in our culture. I think it comes from paying attention to that, um, especially having to do with things like immigration and the outsider, and people that need to be kept in quarantine, or foreign languages that need to be kept out, and so on.
That
Probably there's
sense of poetry gives your own work, I think, a distinctive flavor or characteristic that I can't really. I have to think of other European poets from many decades ago in order to find one that I can make it relate to. Um, and I can, your poetry is just so outside of, I mean, this is a compliment, the parameters of, acceptable mainstream American verse. And yet, you're at a great school, you've got a great job, you're editing and producing all this important work by others. And that's what I meant earlier when I said, how do we avoid becoming the next gatekeepers? I mean, how do we keep from just like our students write like us, right? And then there's is it a tradition, or what? How's that different than Iowa, in a way?
Mm-hmm.
What kind of strategies can we use to resist just duplicating the same problems that led poetry to this cultural dead end in the first place?
Um, I think you mean like when I teach.
I mean, when we, as I guess, I feel like you are getting to the point where you've been successful enough that you've got a little power in the world now, you know.
Hmm.
And when we knew each other, when we first met each other, neither one of us had any power. We were outsiders at a major insider institution, and decades later, we're both tenured.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'll have to cut this part out.
You're making
um,
giving admissions, confessions.
True confessions. I mean, okay, I
Yeah.
guess the community part does come out with me and my students, and I have enjoyed community with my students, and I feel that there is a political power to that. But the more populist poetry becomes, the more that sense of like a general mainstream populism infects, if you will, poetry, the less I tend to like it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't personally have. Do you have a use for the, like, social media poetry is its own thing. We have no control over, what's her name, Rupi Kaur. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, or people like that. Um, and in a way, that is the purest expression of the thing we're talking about. But there's something about it I find really unsatisfying.
Yeah, I mean, I don't like her poetry, but it's not for me, you know. Like one of my daughters likes it. I was like, how can you like this? And she's like, she had her reasons, so it's great. That's what I mean. Like there can be lots of different kinds of poetry. Um, and there are some things I like about her. Like I like the fact that she has a kind of, I like her attitude, and she has a super performative way of reading that poets make fun of online, but I'm like, man, it's interesting, it's like an interesting way of reading. um it's not just your typical poetry reading, so it adds a little something. But yeah, I mean, I don't like that poetry, but so what? I also don't like the stuff that's published in the New Yorker. So yeah, it's different stuff going on.
Yeah, I'm glad. I mean, I guess I'm glad the scene exists, but I guess I'm implying that a certain amount of exclusion is intrinsic to the practice and is always going to be there and isn't a bad thing. We need editors. I value editors, but I think the paradigm for editing has really changed, and it's become much more idiosyncratic and person by person, and less of like, I'm going to look to this venue. There's this one individual that I trust. It's like a YouTube mentality for how you find stuff you like now. Um, and that is problematic to the extent that it doesn't create possibilities for like poetry to grow off of something more coherent, which it does feel like if we had that in poetry, it might inject some life into it. But the other thing I wanted to talk about, and I'm going to shift gears just a little bit right now, I guess, is the idea of like something that's maybe kept your own poems from reaching as mainstream of audiences as I kind of wish it had, because I admire your work, which is your persistent attraction to violence, images of violence, and sexuality, and disruptive, confrontational imagery, and how that works in your work. And you've been doing this ever since I met you. There's nothing that's changed at all about that, which again, I guess I meant that as a compliment. But in some sense, I've always felt like I've never fully got it in a way. I've never fully got it because I've wondered about whether what are you trying to represent, like a mimetic sort put a mirror up to the country, and in a sense of like the violence of culture needs to appear there for your poetry to be relevant. Is it that, or is it just more that these are the themes that interest you, this is what you want to write about? Do you see the violence in your poetry as mimetic?
All right. I think that first, I'll have a few different answers to that question. And first of all is, I am not, like with most people, or like, I don't know if most people, but like many people, I follow my, like my fascinations and my obsessions, and that's why I ended up there. So that is correct. I am really interested in violence and in sexuality kind of stuff as well. But yeah, the violence definitely runs through all of my collections. What I try to do with that, I mean, I had this thought just the other day when I was part of another reading. I started to remember, I also started thinking about like, well, I also, a lot of my poems take place in hospitals. There are a lot of hospitals and a lot of violence. And I started thinking about an experience I had when I was like the summer between 4th and 5th grade. And I had a huge sinus infection. Like my face swelled up. So they had to cut the sinuses open and drain all the stuff out of it. And I had to stay in the hospital. And so during the operation, I still remember the dream I had because I was put under. And it was these doctors with strange masks on and sledgehammers smashing hospital equipment, computer screens, and so on. And then when I came out, I wouldn't eat any food. I just so repulsed by all the food they offer me. And I kept saying I wanted horse broth. And people are like, what? Horse broth? That's disgusting. What are you asking for horse broth? What they didn't know was that like a week or two before I had my operation, my parents had taken me to this avant-garde play about the Paris Commune.
Is this in Sweden?
Yeah, this is in Sweden. So this is like when I was like 10. And part of like the Brechtian approach to this play was at halftime, at the intermission, they gave us, chicken broth, and they said that here's the horse broth. Because, the communards are like starving. They have to kill their horses and they have to eat their horses. And so here's the horse broth. So just the other day, and it strikes me, I'm just like, what does this dream and its violence have to do, and my own like infected face have to do with the Paris Commune? And I feel like there somewhere is actually where a lot of that's like the site of a lot of this poetry. Like, so in some ways it could be said to be like some kind of political invocation of the Paris Commune through, again, like a super material. It's like not me thinking about the Paris Commune, but me wanting to drink the Paris Commune.
Wow.
But then also somehow this violence of these figures in my dream had something to do with some kind of anarchic force. So that's one answer. Like
have you ever been back there again to that place?
No, I don't. Yeah, it was at some kind of castle, castle, like a Swedish castle.
Anything in your dreams?
Or in the dreams.
Has it ever came back to you, that vision?
No, I don't think so. I did have, yeah, maybe, like a few years later, I remember there was a Depeche Mode video where they smash a car, and I remember having this like feeling of recognition in that. So yeah, I guess it did come back. Um,
Was one of the doctors named Benway?
maybe. And I'll tell you another thing that a quote that I often think about that will kind of like go against what I just said, or maybe complicated. Is this quote by Raul Sarita, the great Chilean poet, who was arrested after the coup in 1973 and has been writing poetry about that ever since. He's still writing poetry about the coup in some ways, but it's become more metaphysical or even like religious. And this is what he said: all that I came to do in those years, this is right after the coup, like maybe, the 70s, like the art actions with the Kada, was because I felt that pain and death should be responded to with a poetry and an art that was as vast and strong as the violence that was exercised over us. To place in opposition the limitless violence of crime and the limitless violence of beauty, the extreme violence of power and the extreme violence of art, the violence of terror and the even stronger violence of all our poems. I never knew how to throw stones, but that was not our intifada. You can't defeat a dictatorship with poetry, but without poetry, and this is no metaphor, humanity disappears, literally, in the next 5 minutes. So to me, there's something like, there is a violence of beauty. There is a violence of poetry. And my poems never try to create some kind of space of freedom from the kind of violence of our culture. And he's talking about a coup, but I mean, even in America, there's a constant violence in our system. And I was never interested in poetry that they could create some kind of nice space outside of that. I was always that my poetry was a way of I feel like of counteract, some way engaging with it. I also love the idea of in this quote about how it is like this almost mathematical sense, like this equals that, this equals that. What is that equal sign? I'm fascinated by that. Like what exactly, how do they interact? There seems to be like it has to be stronger. The beauty has to be stronger, according to Sarita. But it also has some ways, it's not just totally opposite from there's a strong connection between the two, the beauty of the poem, the violence of the poem, and the violence of the dictatorship. And it's like an unruly equation. It doesn't necessarily come out neatly, and it will often, I feel like it has to take some of that violence into it. And you see that in Sarita's work, where he, famously said, the Bible taught me to turn my other cheek, and to explain why he burned his face. His first artistic response to the coup was to burn his own face, which is not actually what I don't think what the Bible means when they said turn the other cheek. But again, there's this like weird equal sign that's there's weird distortions that happens in the equal sign, like turn the other cheek equals burn my own face. When you take the world into your poems, I think that kind of the unruly mathematics of that I'm interested in.
Yeah, that's a fascinating answer. It reminds me of I'm blanking on his name right now, but the famous installation artist that was involved in a plane accident and was rescued and wrapped in felt by
Joseph Beuys.
Oh, Beuys, that's right. Yeah. And I have to say I wasn't expecting that story. That's news to me, and that's going to be something that I think is going to be really fascinating to a lot of people. Do you think that moment was, do you frequently have moments like that? Like when you
like
went under and you had a kind of hallucinatory vision? Is that something that's come up in your life again?
yeah, I guess I do have a lot of things like that. I
Yeah.
don't think about it that much, strangely, but I do have moments like that.
You remember
Um,
your dreams?
like really powerful dreams, yeah, or like waking dreams. Um, yeah,
And do you try to like find those spaces again in language in your poetry?
definitely. I definitely do. Yeah. Sometimes I will directly invoke them or describe them, but a lot of times it's about the feeling of them. Um, yeah.
When you write poetry and your poetry assumes the form of a voice, does it feel like your voice?
I mean, I feel like I have like the poet's voice, like I have a poet's voice, and I try to push it in different directions. That's how I make it interesting. But I'm not the kind of person who can just assume a lot of different voices, I think.
Sometimes it
Um,
seems like you let yourself become a vessel in a way, right, in your
mm,
poems, and you let things kind of pour through you. Not in like a giving of, not in that romantic bullshit sense of giving a voice to others, but just more of a, like a open vessel, like a hose or
mm.
something.
I guess I mean, my answer about the violence seemed to suggest that I feel like you have to allow this kind of maybe the scary or the unsettling part of that having that approach to art is that you have to let that violence into you, just like you allow the foreign influence of like other poetry into you. Um, and I think that I like them. I mean, I when we think about voice again, there's so much like agency involved in that. Like this is my voice, and this is how I go out and describe the world. I don't think of my voice like that, but I do have I have an aesthetics. I have that go like you said, like it's pretty constant my whole life writing. Though I try to push against it, just to explore different things. Yeah.
One thing you also push against in your poetry is conventional sense of musicality, I guess, call it. And
Hmm.
this reminds me of conversations that we had many, many years ago. And we were discussing the influence on American music on our writing. And we talked about Dylan's Basement Tapes and Lou Reed and a few others. And you said that these people influenced you more than any poets at the time. And I was struck by that. I'd never heard somebody else whose first love in art seemed to be poetry say that before. And I'm still kind of struck by that. And I wonder if you still feel that way. And how do those kind of, I don't know, musician troubadours or whatever you want to call them, how do they influence your work?
Oh yeah. I mean, I was actually thinking about it, like maybe 15 years ago, somebody asked me this question, and I said no, because I remember this person had seen that I mentioned a lot of like indie rock songs, or like I paraphrased or referenced that, and I felt really uncomfortable about that. I think mainly at that point it was more like I was just taking inspiration from it, but it was unfair of me to not acknowledge it, because I think that music did influence me then. But most importantly, yeah, when I first got started writing, um, when I first started writing, it was this there's a Swedish band, Imperiet, the Empire, which is like a synth kind of like post-punk. I guess they were a post-punk band, and they were in love with this Swedish poet Bruno K. Öijer, who I've now published in translation. Um, so that was really my beginnings, listening to Imperiet, reading Öijer, and then I guess from there, I found Tranströmer, who is obviously not a singer at all. But then I found my mom's old Bob Dylan records and her old Leonard Cohen records, and her old Velvet Underground records, and those things were really powerful for me as I started writing. I mean, I don't know how many hours I spent just like what I now realize is a kind of training, but I was just like looking at different things Bob Dylan was doing, for example, like weird surrealist cuts or contortions of language, and I just like sit and rewrite those kinds of phrases just endlessly because it gave me a lot of pleasure. And but I guess now I realize that that was a kind of training. Like I had those like Blonde on Blonde or Highway 61. Those moves are like in my DNA.
Deeper than the poetry, do you think?
Well, there wasn't the only. I mean, then I also read Allen Ginsberg. I mean, to me, like Howl and America and those early poems are really, really profound. Dronströmer's poems, and Öjer is a poet who also was really influenced by Cohen and Bob Dylan and Ginsberg. So I guess there's a
Interesting that they're all Jewish.
yeah, that's true. They are, except Swedish and Jewish. I hadn't thought of that, but I don't necessarily think that there's a huge contradiction there in the singing versus poem. I feel like they belong to general the same aesthetic terrain. I mean, there's something to do with surrealism, but also I always wanted my poetry to be like visceral, and I never wanted it to be like something like I never wanted to be a difficult poet in the sense of like you have to have a scholarly background or whatever. I wanted to have poetry that made an impact. That might be difficult to deal with, might be difficult to handle, might be hard or painful to engage with, but I wanted it to be a striking poetry, and I think that might come from coming to it partially through singers or music.
Yeah, that's what I assumed you meant when we were first talking about it, because we were both bemoaning the lack of cultural power that poetry had. And at the same time, we also agreed that it wasn't the same as lyrics, and it's its own thing. It doesn't have musical accompaniment most of the time. Actually, let me ask that as a question. I don't know this for sure. Have you ever worked with musicians before? Have you ever written lyrics?
I I don't think so. I have a really poor memory. So any questions about my past, I'm uncertain of. I don't think so. I mean, like you said, my poems have their own kind of rhythms, but they're not usually like musical. They don't, or yeah, they're not really lend themselves to music, I don't think.
More recently in your work, you become more interested in line breaks, I think, and less explicitly prose poetry or mixed genre prose and poetry. What is it about the shorter lines in your newer work that's pulled you in that direction? By the way, I've loved a lot of those poems, especially that poem about being an immigrant that you shared with me many years ago. That was one of my favorites of yours. Sorry, I can't remember the title right now, but I think it's In a New Quarantine, right?
Uh, yeah, I don't know which one you mean, but I agree that that is something I've become more and more interested in. For a long time, I wrote, like you said, a lot of prose poetry, partly because I felt like the line breaks made the poem kind of precious or something like this, and didn't want that. Um, but yeah, lately, line breaks to me, the way they can create a rhythm, like can create a different kind of rhythm, and the way that it can open up with just a sentence or a word to multiple valences.
Like in your poems also arise out of anaphora a lot. You repeat a phrase and to see where that takes you. It feels like a kind of improvisatory poetry in that sense. It's also very different from the songwriting. Do you think that's an accurate description?
Yes, that I use anaphora a lot. Yeah, I totally
And
do.
it's improvised out of nothing a lot of the time too.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, for sure. But that's, someone might say that that is a music, anaphora is a musicality or something like that.
The most
Um,
basic one, right? Just mere
yeah,
repetition. The most
yeah.
elementary one.
I mean, I've always been super interested in anaphora, and repetitions is a repetition is never static, it always changes. That might, yeah, that is definitely just like a core interest of mine.
You mentioned your surrealism when we were talking about songwriters. Do you see your poetry as emergent from the surrealist traditions, or on the margins, outside of it altogether?
No, totally. Yeah. No, it definitely comes out of surrealism. Like I said, like early on, Bruno Coer comes out of surrealism too. I mean, Ginsberg comes out of surrealism, but also I read a lot of surrealist, like French surrealist poetry. I loved Rimbaud from early on. Um, in the in the 90s, I became really engrossed by the Swedish Stockholm surrealist group, which was this kind of really wild surrealist group uh, in the late 80s, early 90s. So, I mean, those were profound influences on me. And this is where Åsa Berg, who I translated, this is how I first came across her. And so that has had a big part of my life.
Talk to
And
me a
beauty
little
must be
bit.
convulsive. I mean, I believe in that. I believe beauty must be convulsive, you know.
Yeah, convulsive. That reminds me of Kafka. There's like all these moments in his work where he's sick and he just starts coughing, and it goes back to being what it was before. They're interrupted by sickness and body betraying him, his body, his tuberculosis. He was dying, but that's another mutual interest. And I did you. I know you love Kafka. I know you've read a lot of Kafka, and
Mm-hmm.
there's a quality in Kafka that I see in your work that I'm wondering if you agree that this is maybe where you got it, or if you feel the same connection I do. But I'm thinking of the like violence and sexuality in the trial, the way it kind of just erupts into the plot. It can also be sort of contained in a way like that. But you probably remember the scene. I think it's called The Stoker, when he opens the door in his
Yeah.
office room, and there's these two men in black leather enacting this sort of S&M routine. One's like torturing another. It's very much sort of Beckett-esque, kind of Waiting for Godot stuff. And then he shuts the door and everything's normal again. And then he goes back a month later and he opens it and everything is the same as it was. There's this sense of the violence just being there waiting. Anytime you open the door, it's going to be there, like this other room besides your own room. And
Mm-hmm.
that's a characteristic I've felt has like kind of one of the things I love about your poetry is that the surprise of it and the way it genuinely is disruptive. Whereas in so much other work, the violence, when it's too mimetic, or in my mind, too mimetic, it becomes like this new frame, its own thing, and no, it
Mm-hmm.
ceases to be disruptive anymore. How have you continued to sustain this kind of disruptive, you know, outpouring of creativity without it, without like, sort of adhering to any one thing that might homogenize it or make it into a coherent new normal?
I think, it's possible I got this from Kafka. I always felt when I read Kafka though that I had a that I had a close connection to it. Um, and I feel like maybe we both got it from the same place, and that's dreams. Like to go back to our earlier discussion, I mean, I feel like that is something that's a dream likeness. Um, and I think, I mean, I feel like people have different views of Freud, mostly negative, mostly disagreeing. But I feel like, at least on a personal level, like Freud got a lot of, and I'm not talking about Oedipus coming, but like something about the way dreams. I feel like he really got that right. The refractions and distortions that happens. Um, I mean, I think he actually got a lot of things right, but
Seems like the
especially the
concept of the
dreams.
uncanny has been useful to you as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that can't be faked, right? Because it's that Freudian quality of when the dreamlike intrudes, which also makes me think of David Lynch. I know we also both love. Yeah, Lynch is a great example. Lynch has this balance between normal and weird. and they intensify each other, right? And there's something kind of like that in your poems too, where I feel like the weird is weirder because of the mundane.
Mm-hmm.
And there's like these two rooms in your work, and you can open either door whenever you want and go into them. And it's to me, that's maybe the most distinctively original quality about your poetry. When I think about it in connection to other people, what makes your work really stand out? And I guess I'm wondering what your reaction to that is, or if that's something you're going for, or
Um,
how does it, and or does it, and how does it relate to Freud while we're talking
I
about it?
mean, like I said, I feel like there's a kind of like this kind of dreamlikeness of it, and that I draw a lot of my energy from those experiences. And also, I love the way you describe it with the two doors. I mean, it makes it sound a little bit like a fairy tale, right? Like the poem is a fairy tale.
I was thinking of the Red Room.
Yeah, or the yeah, I mean,
You
yeah,
pull the curtain back, you know.
yeah, yeah, no, and Breton famously said that what he wanted to do was write fairy tales for grown-ups, and I think that's true of Lynch as well. I mean, he's remaking Wizard of Oz and uh, uh, referencing fairy tales, and so there might be something like the surrealist interest in folk tale and fairy tale and in dreams. I think those things are really formative for me.
Yeah, I guess outside of the US, you're also increasingly well known, perhaps best known for your translations of many Swedish poets, including Berg, whose reputation I think has grown a lot because of your work and your advocacy.
Mhm.
Do you see your own poetry as in dialogue with, or perhaps even in the same tradition as Berg's?
Um, yeah, I mean, I would say there might be two answers to this. On one hand, and I mean, I feel a little disappointed in myself sometimes, and that is that my poetry does fit into a Swedish kind of tradition, more than it does in an American tradition. Americans tend to be more outraged by it than Swedes are like, oh, you obviously somebody who read a lot of Lars Norén. Like people say that a lot to me. Lars Norén is another Swedish writer. Um, so there definitely is that. But then on the other hand, I have taken a lot of inspiration from and a lot of um, I've learned a lot and I've been inspired by a lot by people who are neither American nor Swedish. So, and a lot of times I feel I've as close connection to some of these poets like Kim Il-sung from Korea or Hiromi Ito from Japan, and these are not even, they're not even European poets. But underlying that again is we tend to think about translated poets as existing inside their nations. But of course, all these Swedish poets and these Korean poets, whatever, have read very widely, usually more widely than most Americans, because that's just part of our deal is that we don't read foreign poetry. But so it makes sense. It's not that weird that I should have a lot in common with several Korean poets, or that I should have a lot in common with a lot of Swedish poets, etc., etc., because poetry moves transnationally. So I would say on one hand, yes, I do. The Swedish, there definitely is a place for me in Sweden, or a place inside of me for Sweden. But I also feel like that I'm part of something that's transnational, and that I've made that effort. I might not have made that if I would have never emigrated. I think being an immigrant or an immigrant kind of opens the portals to where you realize that poetry has all these potentialities, and it might be interesting to investigate it. Whereas if I would have stayed in Sweden my whole life, I might have just been a really Swedish poet and uh, just not gone that direction. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of conversations in Iowa and resisting taking a class with a certain person because you don't want that person to influence your work.
Mm.
You're too, you're aware of that possibility, and it's just not where you want to go. I want to ask one other question that's a little different vein here. And it's more of a personal curiosity of mine, since I'm kind of in a similar situation, which is we both teach at very religious universities, Notre Dame and Yeshiva University. And I imagine, I don't know Notre Dame, but I imagine you're working with students whose politics and life positions are very, very different from yours. Probably somewhat hard to relate to, at least speaking personally, it is where I teach anyway. What's it like being having such iconoclastic views and being so kind of invested in disruption and all these values that really don't strike me as Catholic values, and being, the one of the heads of the humanities program at a major, the largest Catholic university, I imagine, in the United States, if not the world? Like, how does that, have you ran into troubles with that? Is it difficult, or does it work somehow? I'm
I
curious.
don't think it's that difficult. I mean, it took me a while to figure out, but it took me in general a while to figure out that in teaching, you have to kind of meet the students where they are. And if I were in, a Jewish school or something like that, I would have to obviously take a different direction, take a different path to them. But then at the same time, I mean, Catholic iconology, iconograph, icono, the imagery, iconography, that, it's full of, it's really violent and beautiful, and and this is like the source of a lot of the Baroque art. So it might not be that big of a leap.
I like that.
Yeah. I mean, we have like, in our classrooms, we have like a naked guy, like on a cross, being tortured. So how how shocking can a little lyrical poem be?
Or how Catholicism expresses itself in Latin America.
Yeah,
It's much like more squirmy and complicated and image
that's
driven.
true. Yeah, that's true. And I don't know, maybe my students don't think of Catholicism that way, but that's there. It's there. It's in the Catholic, in the images, and it's in the also in the thinking about it and the theology. It's strange. It's like a really peculiar theology, and which I don't understand. I don't claim to have any understanding of, but as far as I can tell, it's like, it's very strange, and there's a reason why surrealism and the Baroque has a Catholic connection.
Sounds like you feel fairly at home there.
Yeah, or I mean, but on the other hand, also people who feel at home. I've not been that person. I've not felt at home for a very, very long time in my life, and so I'm not really that bothered by it. If somebody can't go and teach to people who aren't like that, that must be a person who does not have much experience being an outsider, or does not have much experience being out of your comfort zone or out of your home. So I actually do have experience with that. My whole life, more or less, it's been away from, like, in a state of not being at home. So I had some training at it. Though maybe my natural combativeness, it took a while to just like figure out how to not alienate people. But yeah, I get along pretty well.
Well, it's been really fascinating catching up with you like this, and I'm sorry it's taken so long for us to have this conversation, but it reminds me of old times, and I learned a lot. And so I guess I would just want to end this interview by thanking you again for doing it, and I hope we see each other again soon and can talk some more.
Yeah, thank you so much for your questions.